This is our subject today. We're going to talk about Scotland's People. It's a fantastic resource, Scotland's People. You know, it's got so much stuff in it. A number of you said in your pre-registration poll that you were familiar with Scotland's People, but quite a large number said that they'd never experienced it, had never even registered to use Scotland's People. So in today's topic, we're going to talk about Scotland's People, and I hope those of you that have experience with Scotland's People will contribute what you know about, you know, the benefits and how and tricks and how to use it, and what you've been able to find by, you know, what you've learnt from how to find people. That's our purpose here today. Fantastic thing. It's the government, it's like the births, deaths and marriages register for Scotland. Well, it goes a bit further than that because another number of other official bodies are part of the consortium that put it together. And the picture that you've probably seen on the Facebook page has the register house where the you know, the records are kept, and that's the sort of go-between for the Scotland's People. Yeah, so the idea is that we'll talk about what's available there and what is not available, and how you can get onto it. We'll talk about quite a few tricks in accessing the information from there, because there are quite a lot of tricks. I'll talk for about 25 minutes. I'll try to break a little bit in the middle so that we have another chance to talk. I'd like you experienced users to contribute to the discussion at various points as we go along. Before we start, can you all check you've muted your microphones? That's good, unless you're actually speaking, of course. And I'd like 5 people who are here today, not everybody, I guess, but just those that want to talk about where in Scotland their ancestors came from. And here's a map of some of the major parishes we would expect to find MacLennans in. So those dark orange ones are the sort of main places that we expect to find people. Would somebody like to unmute their microphone and tell me where their ancestors came from? Barbara's on it. Good on you, Barbara. No, go on, who's speaking?
John's from Gairloch, Kenneth from Gairloch Parish.
I'll just get the pointer working. So Gairloch is here, and Applecross is here. Yeah, Applecross is quite interesting because, you know, there's a little village there called Applecross, very tiny village, but worth a visit. A good pub there to have a drink in the, you know, late evening in summer, right on the waterfront. But when we talk about Applecross, we mean the parish of Applecross, which includes all of this area here like this. That is the whole of Applecross. Sometimes there's a separate sub-parish called Shieldaig, which covers this bit up here, but not all periods that we're talking about. So generally, we just talk about Applecross, and people who come from this part up here, even though it was called something different originally, Shieldaig, will talk about themselves as from Applecross, even though that's officially registered as something else originally, you know, in subsequent censuses. Yep, another one?
Loch Alsh.
Loch Alsh, you see down here, Loch Alsh? That's it. Now, Loch Alsh is a parish that is quite interesting. In fact, there's a place here, Plockton. Can you see that on your screens? And Plockton is a part of the Loch Alsh parish. That's why I've talked about it there like that, because people will say that they're from Plockton, which is in Loch Carron. Now, Loch Carron is this area up here, this area. See that says Strathcarron there? Is a Loch Carron parish, but this, and it includes a bit along this coast here, but Plockton is squarely in Loch Alsh parish. So if you're looking for a registration of a birth in Plockton, you don't look in Loch Carron, you look in Loch Alsh, yeah? And, you know, the more modern term is Kyle of Loch Alsh, and that's not the term that would have been used in the 1800s at all, not known. In fact, the parish...
I was duly corrected.
Hmm?
I was duly corrected on that one.
And the parish church, you know, the traditional church from Loch Alsh, wonderful place, is actually along here. And as the historian I met there in Loch Alsh, my wife's ancestor was the minister in Loch Alsh at the time of Culloden.
Oh.
So we had a good opportunity in there to go and talk to those people at the history centre and so on. And so much for Jacobites. You know, they wrote a letter to the government saying how wonderful it was they had a win at Culloden, the ministers. Anyway, so the church, the traditional church from Loch Alsh is actually along here, not up at where. And as they told me at the time, they said this only became a significant place once the railway arrived. The railway comes along this coast here, round here and down to there. And that's where it terminates, the Highland Railway. So the village of Loch Alsh, as we call it now, or Kyle of Loch Alsh, is a modern invention subsequent to the railway arriving. And a lot of places are like that. The churches typically are on the coast, you know, because the highways in early times were from the sea. You know, the sea was the highway for all these people over here. Roads were not of great significance. Just trails for driving cattle, that was the only other thing. Anybody else?
Slumbay and Loch Carron.
Yeah, here. Loch Carron.
Yeah, Loch Carron and Slumbay, which is right part of it.
Yeah, that's it. And there's now a village called Loch Carron, which is here, but in older times that was not called Loch Carron, the village. So if you see someone who's born in Jeantown or Janetown, then you know that's the former name of the what you might call capital of Loch Alsh, Loch Carron parish, and it goes right up into here, Loch Carron, and it comes down this coast here. Yeah, another one.
Loch
Oh, sorry.
Malcolm.
Sorry, Corrivic, Corrivic.
Oh yeah. So you know, thank you for that. That's great. There's this parish here that so many MacLennans came from. Conton. It's one of the very few parishes that doesn't have a border on the water. You know, on the ocean. But nearly all the parishes run down to the ocean from all over Scotland. But this one is a you know, landlocked parish. Not the only one, but there are many. And this valley, this glen through here, as they're called, you know, the valley, known as Strathconan, or so in older times sometimes spelled Strathconan, A-N, is a beautiful little valley. You probably saw it on that pre-show. I did put a few of my photos in there. So many MacLennans in this valley, and up in the upper reaches of it, that's up here is where Malcolm's talking about, where his ancestors came from. In fact, I just read a paper about those people up there and how progressively the different estates in this glen were not so much cleared in one dramatic movement, but people allowed to drift away after the 1840s. In fact, my ancestors came from up here.
Thanks, Bruce. I didn't know where it was.
Illicit whiskey distilling is one of the things it's famous for, this valley. It's called Strathconan. The other thing I've got in black type, this is not a parish as such usually. The parish is called Conton. So if you're looking for someone who comes from the Strathconan and even up in the upper reaches of Strathconan, you look for this parish, Conton, usually. Not always. Sometimes the minister from Fodderty, which is over here, registered people who were born in this part. So you'll see them in the Fodderty register. Because, you know, remember we're talking about in the 1700s, this was a wild place. In fact, a MacLennan minister from Fodderty was, what do you call it? You know, unauthorised, made, whatever the word is. He got his ticket removed to work as a minister because he refused to go into the wild valley up here in the 1700s. You know, it's not that long ago compared to what we're talking about, only 100 years earlier. One more.
I'm from Kintail.
Kintail, Rory.
Kintail, yeah.
Kintail, that's good. I think we've covered these things pretty well. So Kintail here, I said my wife's family were from Lochoush. Her next descendant down became the minister of a parish that's called Glen Shiel in here. Glen Shiel was disjoined, as they say, you know, separated out. Kintail used to cover this area around here, and this area here, and the Five Sisters over here. But in the 1740s, this was taken disjoined. So if you go to where the old church used to be, the Kintail Church, where the famous cemetery is, that's used on all our banners and things in the genealogy pages, that used to be the church for Kintail, including Glen Shiel, and the Glen Shiel people continued to bury their people at the former church there. Have any of you been to that graveyard? Clachan Dewick, it's called.
Yeah, my father's buried there.
Great.
Yeah.
And you know, there's such a nice connection with that cemetery and Kintail, that all the meeting rooms that we have in this event are connected with that cemetery. So you've got that cemetery. There's a fellow there who was a minister who didn't ever minister in Kintail, but he went to Waipu. Do you know the Waipu story? You know, there's these people who went from Cape Breton, from St Anne's Bay, that picture I showed in the preview there. They went from Cape Breton. They built their own boats sometimes, not always, but 6 ships went out, including one of John MacLennan's relations, to a place north of Auckland, about 2 hours north of Auckland. Nearly 1,000 people emigrated from Cape Breton. So that ties together the 3 things. There are rooms: the Kintail room we had yesterday, the Waipu room we had, you know, in the morning, and the Cape Breton story. Now the guy, you know, we've got the 3 things covered. Okay, well that's enough of that. So looking at Scotland's people itself. Put your hand up if you're already got an account there. Already got an account? No, not a lot don't have, right? And I'm told that some people are hesitant about joining Scotland's People because there's you know, they're worried that they've got to subscribe and pay money and so on. Well, you don't. You just go to this website. It's, you know, Scotland's People. You can easily find it. Click on register. And you can buy credits to access birth certificates and death certificates and other things. But, and you buy them in lots of like 10, 30, 40, so on. You know, you have them there ready to use. But you don't even need to pay anything, ever, really. You can do the searching and get the results from searching now for nothing. You used to have to pay 1 credit and 5 credits to get a certificate, but now you just pay 6 credits for the certificate and pay nothing to get the search results. And the search results are quite good in Scotland's People, I got to say. It's a fantastic resource. So I hope you, after this session today, you all sign up and start using it. It's really good. So the big date to remember here is 1855. 1855 was the year that they introduced statutory compulsory registration of births, deaths and marriages. So from that date on, you should have a certificate for any of those events that happened. Now, just at the edges, of course, they didn't get all the parishes ready on the 1st of January. Some took a few months, and you might still see them in old church registers until the places got organised. But, you know, by and large, that's the big picture. 1855. And before that, we use what are called OPRs, or Old Parish Registers, or Old Parish Records, Old Parish Registers, or Church Registers. You can see the term is here, Church Registers. Yeah, they're inevitably patchy, the Church Registers, and we'll talk about them a bit further in a minute. I've got to say, as a little aside here, that if you have a relative who was born, married, or died in 1855 itself, not in 1856, but in 1855, you've got you're very lucky, because at first when they introduced it, they asked for a lot more information than they did subsequently. So that if you have a, you know, like a birth in 1855, you get how many babies the mothers had already, you get what place the mother and the father were born in. You get how old the mother and the father are, you know, all this fantastic extra stuff. And with deaths, you get the cemetery where they're buried that you don't get in the subsequent death records. Shame, but you know, that's how it is. So if you've got a relative in 1855 itself, that's top full, you know, you can celebrate. You're allowed to celebrate, feel free. So this image shows some of the other things that are available. We're going to talk about the after 1855 ones in a minute. For now, I'm going to talk about church registers. You can see that also you've got census returns available, and we will talk about those in a bit afterwards. I'm not going to talk about valuation rolls, which I gather are quite useful sometimes. I don't use them much myself. And then legal records. And down here you've got poor relief, and I haven't used it, I've got to say, but because we have a lot of poor relief applications in our records already. One of the early researchers went into the Scotland's People house and collected, you know, in the poor relief applications, they say, I've got 4 children and one's dead and one's, you know, got a big family and can't support me and this sort of thing. They're asking for help and they're explaining why their own family can't help them and who they are, you know, how old they are and whether they're married, how many children they have and that sort of thing. So a lot of that though is already in our database, so we haven't had to collect that information. Okay, so within the church registers themselves, you've got these options: the births and the baptisms, the marriages, the deaths and burials, and other events. Now it's fair to say that I'll just click onto the next one. In the church registers, so that's the same thing. Quite a lot of them have been lost. Yeah. So they didn't survive. People talk about horses going through rivers and the register floating down the river, things like that. And also just, you know, somehow didn't left behind somewhere, that sort of thing, or were never kept in the first place. So we had in the Church of Scotland what was called the disruption in the early 1840s, which saw half of the congregations, not just a small amount, but half of the congregations leaving the established church and setting up their own church, complete church, you know, the equal size to the Church of Scotland, and parishes had to decide. So they often didn't have proper registers when they first walked out from the old church. They didn't have buildings to worship in. They often worshipped in the outdoors. Because the point of the disruption, those of you that don't know about it, was that congregations were objecting to being told who they should have as a minister by their local lairds, you know, their aristocracy. They wanted to choose their own ministers. And so, of course, the laird who controlled the land wouldn't give them, wasn't in favour of them and didn't give them, you know, land to build their church on. In some cases, in many parishes. So they would just have to worship in the outdoors. Or go to a neighbouring parish where they were sympathetic, you know, had the whole congregation there had already gone to the Free Church. The Free Church was the one that tended to be more outward looking in terms of, you know, missionaries being sent to other countries and those types of things. The Free Church was really the one that did a lot of that. And the sort of ideas you had going with emigration were more Free Church oriented, meaning that they were more independent people, more independent minded. In many years later, in the early 1900s, they got back together. And I think it's fair to say they probably took more of the ideas of the Free Church into the ongoing church than they did the former established church. So church registers. So there are probably more births got recorded than marriages in the church registers. And I guess that's because they wanted their child, the parents wanted their child to have, you know, they would go to heaven, in other words, when they, you know, died, if they died young or something. Marriages, they're not quite as many. You just got to assume that the parents were married often. And there are very few deaths, at least in the parishes that we're dealing with. I suspect there might be a few more in places like Edinburgh and so on, but in the parishes we've just been looking at, there are very few death records, almost none, and probably none in many parishes at all. You just occasionally you find a headstone, but in fact headstones are not that common in Scotland compared to what we see in our outside places. I suspect they might not use headstones because they might have felt it was a bit too boasting or something to have a headstone. The formats, of course, of these church registers vary from one to the other. Sometimes they have a column for the birth date and the baptism date for the child, birth and baptism dates. Sometimes they have only the baptism date, because that's the purpose of them, really, isn't it? To see that who's been baptized, not what date they were born. Sometimes they'll have a father but no mother. That's a bit of a miracle baby, isn't it? That was a joke. And no, but they just write the father. And in fact, in a way, registering fathers is more, the mother already knows who that the baby's theirs, don't they? You'll sometimes see marriages without parents' names, and more often than not, the marriages that are recorded in the OPRs, the parish church registers, don't have the parents of the bride and the groom. Then you've got the ongoing dramatic thing of spelling. This is really our main exercise for today, to think about spelling. So we'll talk about that shortly. This is what an OPR record can look like. Look at that. How good is that? What an amazing thing. This is, Barbara, you'll be interested in this one, one from Applecross. AX is the abbreviation for Applecross. You'll be surprised to hear. And look at it. This here's our man, right? This is this relevant thing here. That says 1822. You could be forgiven for thinking that didn't say January, and it certainly says 20. And then it says, Donald, son of Neil MacLennan, separate words, ampersand, Isabel, Mackenzie, and then it gives their place, which is this Arkin trade here. So that's what you're looking at sometimes in these old parish records, just a handwritten thing, no columns, no dates. This is the famous John McQueen, the minister at Applecross in those times, in the 1820s and so on. He was there far too long, obviously, for his writing. I should mention that this format for dates, International Genealogy date format, is day, month, Y. So this months is written, of course, in letters. So you write it like this, 20 Jan 1822. And if you write it in those dates, most genealogy software will then be able to calculate the, the age and the, calculations of the various other things. So you have to write the date in that format. So if we have a chance to sort of exchange things, and I tend to transcribe dates into the genealogy format, even though they're not written in that way in the original document, so that when I copy and paste it into the date field, I don't make the mistake of putting it in the wrong format. So, just tend to use that as a little discipline to myself. I'm sorry, I'm looking up at the second screen, Sky. You'll comment on this later, I'm sure. Because I haven't got the stuff down the bottom. Yeah, spelling. We said we'd talk about spelling. In the Scotland's People, you have these options in the search that you're doing over here. So you can have fuzzy matching, wildcards allowed, names that begin with, name variants, phonetic matching, these sorts of options. I've got to say to you that whereas the Mac part of the name, whether it's MC or MAC, is often a separate, it's actually a separate word, really. And so it's often written with a space. And in fact, I saw a headstone only a short time ago that had, clearly a space between the Mac and the L. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. Obviously, this person knows the traditional spelling. But generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, if there's a space in the word in Scotland's People original handwritten records, like we saw in that one just a second ago, they will have compressed it so they've got rid of the space in the surname. So that's just a thing they've done, to modify it. So And I don't tend to worry about that too much. I just compress it into one in the more modern way, really, despite the fact that in the original document, it's got a space in there. And you see this problem, actually, speaking of Cape Breton, you know, a lot of the censuses in Cape Breton in early times, they knew it was a separate word. So they would write the MAC, then give the first name, and then put the Lennan bit out on the other end. It's a really common thing in Cape Breton censuses. Or even MC, they'll put there something quite often. You know, they'll put it attached to the first name, in front of the first name, and then they'll have the first name, and then they'll have the family name at the being just Lennon. They need to be alert to that, but that's a Cape Breton problem, not a Scotland's People problem. The good news is that most of the spaces are gone. Something that's, I think, relevant to most of you is that in the 1800s, which is the main period that we're talking about, the OPRs, this is like from up to 1855, the MacLennan name was spelt 70% of the time MCL in Scotland. So you can do, this is marriages I'm talking about because you give your own, you can do the search yourself and see that, but so expect to see the name spelt MC more often than you see it spelt MAC in those times. But you don't know which, because one week they'll record it as MC and the next week they'll record it as MAC. So, you know, and quite often these people were illiterate as well, of course, so you can't be certain what it was, but they weren't that fussed about spelling, you've got to say. So you need to search for all possibilities. Let me just move on to the next one. And this is the secret of how we do it, usually. I'm letting you in on the big secret here. We put a wild card in there, or a wild character, and it's not just one character. If this name was spelt with two C's, you know, like with a capital C, then that would still catch it. So in other words, the wild card or the wild character will allow for several characters in that space, not just the one. Someone asked me that question. It was too obvious to me, but good to pass it on. So, and you'll be surprised how many times in the old parish records the name is written with one N in the middle there and not two. So we should allow for that. This is not the be all and end all. And certainly if you're researching in Canada or the US or whatever, this is not the only answer to your question. Because in Canada and places like that, we see much more often MacLennan and, you know, MacLennan with an O in it and so on. But in Scotland's People, this is a good way to do it. The next main trick, oh, sorry, I'll just give you a tip what I do. When I first started using Scotland's People, I put this spelling in capital letters, like that, uppercase. And then when I search for any other name, I put it in lowercase, so that when it comes up showing me what I've searched for before, you know, in Windows and so on, I can easily pick out the one that I want to use as the default by seeing the capitals. That's just my own little trick. It doesn't matter whether you put it in capitals or lowercase. You shouldn't worry about capitalizing usually. So the main tip is to cast your net wide, you know, just leave out the forename altogether often. Just look for some little date range and see what you get. Then maybe put one or two letters in and see how that goes. If you think they're born in the year range, you think they're born in some year, just put a really wide 5 years either side and see how you go. So cast your net wide to start with. Allow for both sexes, because you'd be surprised how many people were born in Scotland with unknown sexes. So you know, put both, because you get unknown quite often. And not so much in these OPRs that we're talking about, but it's relevant to the statutory registration that in Scotland, if you were born in the late December and registered your baby, if you had a baby born in late December and you registered it in early January, it will get recorded as a birth for the year you registered it in, rather than the year the baby was born in. So nearly always when I'm searching for a birth, even if I know exactly the date they were born, I'll put in the next year so that you can catch up with people who are born and registered in the year after. You get them too. Now, this is not the be all and end all to searching, but it's a good start. You know, these are some of the other options you might like to try if you don't find them using that default one. The ones you try to avoid, of course, are MacLean, you know. Like you can see there, you're not going to get MacLean because there are lots of MacLeans. Or do you say MacLean? So maybe with the anyway, whatever, MacLean or MacLean. And this will not get you MacLean's either, MacLean. Yeah? Makes sense? Now, let's talk about forenames. This is where we're going to have a bit of a chat here. I hope you'll all contribute to this, but just to kick it off, when you start to put the forenames in like that, I always recommend to people putting Murdo in so that you can get M-U-R-D-O-C-H. The name is often just written Murdo like that in Scotland, or probably as often as it's written Murdoch. And sometimes Murdoch is written with a K, not so much in Scotland as you see in other parts of the world, but sometimes. So if you put in Murdo, you know, you always should do that, is my suggestion. Never bother putting the CH in. And the most common spelling by far in Scotland is without an E. Sometimes you'll see more often an E, I-E, than you will see Anne with an E. So just put in Anne, you know, and you'll get all the Annes. You'll get Annabella and all these things as well. But, you know, they're not so common, so that it doesn't matter. You'll get Annabella. You don't have a name, you know, just put Anne. That's the most easiest way. Now, Catherine, well, that's really, I went through all the old people, all the MacLennan records and looked at all these weird spellings of things and came up with a list for some work we did in matching records. These are some of them, but there are many more. And of course, a bit of it comes from the fact that they were Gaelic speakers. Nearly most of these people we're talking about were not even English speakers, and they just had to make up an English version of their name, a bit like Chinese do that, don't they? They make up just a name. It doesn't even need to be the same as anything like their Chinese name. But like, for example, Catherine, we've got sometimes Catherine with a K that I haven't written here, but Catherine, Catharin, like that. Is often written Kate, so someone who's born Catherine like that might be Kate when she marries, or might be KT, or might be the more Gaelic version, Keat. Those of you that have read some of the Lewis series will know Keat, you know, the books. Then you've got, you know, a girl's name, Christian, is very common in these period of the old parish records before 1855. A girl's name, not a boy's name. Never a boy's name, Christian, in Scotland. And that person might, as the time went on, the same person who was called Christian when she was born possibly became Christy when she married, and probably when she died she was called Christina. That would be a typical thing for someone born about 1830, something like that. So you've got to cover off those possibilities. And other possibilities for that name. Anybody, come on, let's have some suggestions here. Other names like it might be the variants of Christina.
Got a Kitty.
Kitty. Yep. Jack, good.
I have several Tinas, T-E-N-A.
T-E-N-A. Wow. Yeah, that's right.
Christina.
Tina, exactly. And T-I-N-A as well?
No, none of those, but the E is very prominent.
Uh-huh.
Bruce?
Others, what I was hoping to elicit was Kirsty, you know, and Kirsty could be spelled with a K or a C, and you know, so you could have C-H-I-R-S-T-Y or I-E. My sister-in-law's called Christy, I-E. Lots of variants. Kirsty with a K, you know, it's quite hard to get those girls.
Bruce, I actually have another variation of Kate. I actually have a friend who's Scottish, who lives in Scotland now, and her name is spelled C-E-I-T.
C-E-I-T.
It is pronounced Kate.
Yeah, right.
That's another.
Or, you know, like the chief sister is called Kirstine. That's the same name. They're all variants of the same name.
And I see
Kirstine with a K.
in some of my records I found for Catherine, Kett, K-E-T-T.
Exactly, yep. That's
Yeah.
that same, like the last one there. So, you know, Catherine, it's a bit of a problem name.
Yeah.
But
Thanks, Chris.
Jean, the next one down there, is equally difficult. You know, they can be called Jane or Jean completely interchangeably. You know, on the same document, they'll write just different names, or Jeannie or Janie or, you know, variants like that. And of course, it's better if they have the same spelling for the first few characters. You can just put that in with a star at the end of it. that deals with it. But Jean, Janie, Jane, Jeanette, they're all variants. And I think there's quite a good Wikipedia page for Gaelic names and their English equivalents that, you know, you might help you if you're looking for some odd people. And John is pretty good. Actually, one that does surprise me is, you know how my brother's name is Donald, right? My great-grandfather was Donald, his father was Donald, my uncle's Donald, they're everywhere. But very rarely do you see in Scotland the name abbreviated to Don. You'll see it written in the old parish records as D-O-N''D, but Scotland's people will always spell it in full Donald, which I guess is a good thing. And John, you'll sometimes see written in these funny ways, but generally speaking, John is written the way it's written. Although someone mentioned yesterday, in fact, one of the researchers who lives near Liverpool, his father was registered as John when he was born, and never thereafter, well, no, when he was very young he was John, but once he became a teenager he started calling himself Ian, the Gaelic equivalent of John, and never, you know, he was married as Ian and died as Ian, and his headstone says Ian, and although he was John.
Yeah, we have a couple of Ians I have a Callum Ian McCory as a cousin, and the Ian was for his grandfather, who was John.
Yeah, and, you know, but I think it's fair to say no. I was going to say there are fewer Ians than you might expect, but there are quite a lot of Ians. Well, there are many more Johns. We always joke about Johns, just how many there are. And if you're looking for a John, good luck. I mean, really, in a way, this is what the benefit in having our own genealogy resource, but because it means we can buy all the Johns or get the record of all the Johns, and then if you go looking for a John, you're really in trouble. You really got to know the John's wife, I would say, to be sure you got the right one. Because, you know, they typically don't have middle names in this period we're talking about, Scots, and they just called John, and there are so many of them. And you really got to know who their parents were or who their wife was to be able to find them. Rory and Roderick, that's another one. This other one, have you seen this before, anybody? Janet and Jessie?
A lot.
A lot. Who said
I
that?
thought it was Jane. So it's Janet, and Janet is the correct name. It's not Jane.
No, Jane is more like the Jean and Jane and Jeannie. Jessie and Janet are totally interchangeable. In fact, I forgot to put this one in, but I felt silly when someone said when I reviewed it with a few people, this PowerPoint presentation, they said, what about Janet and Jessie? Well, my great aunt was christened in Glasgow or near Glasgow, Janet, and she was known all her life. She married as Jessie, and she was in the censuses as Jessie. She was never Janet thereafter.
Bruce, can I ask about the name Finlay? I have
Finlay.
a lot of them, and they're problematic.
Yeah, they are, yeah. Well, especially when they go to Canada, they start calling themselves Philip Finlays.
Ah, yes. Is there another Scottish
in the US, the same. US, you see the same. Sorry?
Is there another version, a Scottish version, Gaelic version of Finlay?
Yeah, Finlag, or yeah, I can't spell it. Don't ask me to spell it. But read the Lewis books. You know, the Lewis series, the Black House and so on. You'll see the coming out there.
Bruce, I have a cousin, Roderick MacLennan, and it's R-H-O-D-R.
Really? Yeah.
They throw an H in there.
Well, of course, that's the chief's name is Rurid, but that's the Gaelic name version of Roderick. That's the Gaelic, and of course it's spelt many different ways, Rurid, and that's why I think they very often will shorten it to Rory, because it sounds more like Rurid. You know, it sounds more than Roderick does. Like it's sort of a nickname, but it's sort of also closer to the Gaelic Rory. They say Rory as in brewery. That's how you pronounce it. And that's how you pronounce the chief's name. You know, it's hard to spell the way the chief spells it, but that's another variation. In fact, you know, the fellow who was the chief that died in the battle east of Inverness, he's always spelled another way, a different way. So, you know, they're really translating from the English. So this gives you a bit of a clue to look for things. Now, the other interesting thing about this slide is, you see how often these MacLennans here are spelt with only one N in the middle? Look at that. And there, you know, you're getting, because I put this in there, you're getting the result Murdo like that, but you're also getting Murdoch. There are no K's there, but that's the spelling. Okay.
So does Kenneth have an alternate?
I don't think so. I can't remember hearing any, no. And certainly not Ken. I think that, you know, in Scotland, they tend to call Kenneth Kenny. But I don't think they'd ever put that formally in a document. So now we're talking about the statutory registers. You know, this is after 1855. We've got compulsory registration. And now those available to us when we click on this link here are births from 100 years ago, before 100 years ago, marriages before 75 years ago, that's up to 1945, and deaths 50 years ago, that's 1970. This is generally, I think stillborns and so on are a bit more recent, you can get them. But that's the general thing, normal thing now at this year. But the really nice thing about Scotland's people, unlike most places, like in most jurisdictions that I'm familiar with, they don't give you a search result for people who are born after, let's say, 1920. But in Scotland, you get the search result for people born only, you know, recently, like months ago, or died months ago. You can get the results. It tells you this is the parish that they died in, and you know how old they were, and so on. Mother's name sometimes, not always. But you know, you can still get the search results. It took me ages to learn this. I'm passing this trick on to you to get in early. You get the search results, but you can't buy the document online. You can buy the document offline. You might be asked to explain sometimes, but you can get it. And the other nice thing about Scotland's people is that the death records are indexed on the woman's, in case of married women, on both their maiden name and their married name. That's fantastic. It's really good because it means you can put in the, you know, married name, which is the normal thing in most places. You know, most jurisdictions, you can only search on the married name. And if you don't know who they're married, well, you're sunk, aren't you? But in Scotland, you can search on the maiden name and get the result. Or if you know both the married and the maiden name, and you've got, you know, like a common Mary, but you know that she was a MacGyver, as they call it in Scotland, MacGyver, you might say. As a husband, well, you put in MacGyver with a star in there for the A in case it's C or AC. And you get the person and you think, well, that's it. That's the parish where she lived. You know, that's the right age. You can see all that on the search results without, you know, it's a fantastically useful thing. And because the age is given for the deaths, that's a really valuable thing too. You know, because you can say, well, this is not a baby of 5. We know that person was about 80 or something. Then you got the right one. And again, up to 1930, you should expect in Scotland, and this is contrary to what Scots think themselves, that the name MacLennan is spelt MC. You should expect it to be spelt MC up to 1930. As my friend from Vancouver says to me, he says in Cape Breton, all the people had MC spelling in their names in Cape Breton in the 1901 census, and in the 1911 census, they all changed their spelling to MAC. It's not quite true in Cape Breton even, but it's, you know, it's sort of pretty true that they were just changed it by a stroke of the pen, the spelling of their names. But in Scotland, you know, they don't really think that MC is a common spelling, because today most Scots spell the name MAC, right? Then they think that all the colonial people changed it when they went to the colonies. That's wrong. In Scotland, the most common spelling was MC. And that's why, of course, the most common spelling in the colonies is MC, because, you know, they went in the time, in the 1800s, when that was the common spelling in Scotland. And so you can just prove this yourself by going and searching for the marriages in both MC and MAC, MacLennan, and you'll find that 71% in Scotland up to 1930 was spelled MC. What do you think about that, Catherine? It's, yeah, just be alert that that's a possibility. That's really what I'm saying there.
Was,
Okay.
excuse me, it's Rory here.
Yep.
Was there a connection with the MCs being more Catholic as opposed to the MACs being Protestant?
Yeah, that's a common misunderstanding, I would say. In the you particularly hear that said in Lewis and Harris, because, you know, there you've got quite a large Catholic population in the south of Harris, in Uist too, especially, and so they will say that to you, that we use the MAC spelling because we don't want to be thought of as Catholics. It's not true. Not true, because we're only looking here at the Protestant records, right? In the OPRs, we're not looking at the Catholic registers, and we're still getting 70%. It's a common misunderstanding.
Bruce, when we submit information on our MacLennans, do you want it in the MCL format?
I don't mind really. Our thing, what I've done as a standard thing, because you can't just change it every time they spell it differently, each document and so on. So by default, what we did in Scotland was to put in the name as MC, the most common spelling, up to 1900. And then our default in Scotland is to spell it MAC after that, unless they appear to be sticking with the MC spelling. Yeah. So if someone really is calling themselves MC, then, you know, we tend to call them MC still, because that's what they think of as their spelling. But in Scotland, we would by default, where they're, you know, ambivalent about how they spell it, change over to MAC at 1900-ish. Of course, you can't do it in a single family that has some kids born in the late 1890s and some kids born in the early 1900s. You've got to take one or the other usually. Although, you know, I'm very often surprised that I think MacDonald or Macpherson are names that are nearly always spelled MAC, and I think that in my head, and then I look at the next one I come to and it has it spelled MC, and I think, hang on, like, and you'll often, you know, the funniest one is where you'll see a wife spelling her name MC when the husband spells it MAC, and of course she's only got the M MacLennan name because she's got it from the husband. How can that be? It's just, you know, you don't want to get too uptight about it. That's really, I don't mind how you submit them really, but that's our default. Before 1900 MC, and after 1900 MAC. It just, you know, but if people insist, I'll do it whichever way they like really. Because we use we'll look next week. We'll look at our records and see how they appear. Sorry, did I do that one? No. So this is a death result, and this gives you a really good idea what the whole thing's like. If you put, I was looking for Ellen. I was trying to do an example of what you get if you're looking for Ellen, and whether, because Helen we didn't talk about a minute ago, but Helen and Ellen are quite interchangeable. Someone who's called Helen in their birth, might be called Ellen in their marriage or in the census or whatever. So I thought, oh, I'll put in Ellen. I put in the star thing to get Ellens as well as Helens, but I didn't get any Ellens, actually, as it turned out. But I thought, nonetheless, this was quite a good example here because it illustrates so many of the things. Include unrecorded mother's name is a thing there. You can see if you type it in, or I really don't know why that happened, but that's an option. And here's the mother's name appearing. I'm not sure why that's not ticked, and there's still one's unrecorded mother's names there between you and me. But over here, you've got the ones that have been bought. So the age the age we talked about. Now, the ones that have been bought, say paid on them after you bought them. If you want to buy a new one, you click on that blue one there and you pay the 6 credits. Now, 6 credits is only £1.50, about, $3 or so. So that's pretty good value. Now, coming to, this is really what we want you to think about a lot. In this registration district, RD, is what we try very hard to use in our clan database, the same wording that's in here, so that later we can match up the two lists, Like we want to say, have we got, at the moment, someone is doing a comparison between all the statutory marriages in Scotland's People and all the marriages in our records. And only by knowing the district that having in our records, the district that appears in here, can you really match up the two. If we start putting Strathconnan, for example, which is, not a parish, into our records as the place they were married, then we won't be able to match them. So we're really trying very hard to put this wording in such a way that if we did a match, we cross-match them, we can see. And a bit of a problem with our records is that we sometimes have married in Glasgow, but actually there are a few number of registration districts in and around Glasgow, including some in Renfrewshire, which is another county to Lanarkshire, where most of Glasgow is. So people say they're married in Glasgow. We're converting them from Glasgow to whatever the marriage record in Scotland's People says, and we haven't completed that yet. So any questions about that before I move on? But you can see there I put the point of this is that I put the MacLennan name, the married name, and the other surname is her maiden name. And I put all those with the examples of the stars in them. So what we would like you to do, this is a bit like a party paid announcement, is when you do a search like that and you see we don't have that, what we call citations, meaning the search results in our record for Helen, then I want you to just copy that, select it and copy it and just shoot it off to me, paste it into an email, and here's I number something or other, here's Helen's record. That's a death. If you want to be, if you want to be even more helpful, you could click it to paste it as text only. That's, when you click right mouse click to paste it into the email, you choose the third option, not the normal copy with formatting option. That removes all the cells that come across if you'd put the formatted version. And if you really want it to be helpful, you could put commas in after the different events, but just send it to me. That's the main thing there. And now we're looking again at this is the relevance of these orange places. They are the registration districts, some of the registration districts. There are many more, but these are the big ones that you will see for our people. And you won't see Black Isle, for example, as a place. You will actually much later on as Black Isle becomes a registration district. But it's not a registration district in the times we're talking about usually. And these are the counties here: Ross and Cromarty and Inverness-shire. Inverness-shire covers this area here like that. Glenelg over there, and all of Skye, of course, is in Inverness-shire. Now let's talk about censuses. So the censuses were taken in each decade. The ones that we find useful are from 1841 and currently available up to 100 years ago is the 1911 census. Quite soon we'll have the 1921 census, yeah? That'll be quite interesting. You can get them from Scotland's People, but I'm going to say to you that that'll cost you money to get each one. So we don't normally use that as the default way to get a census. But they're very helpful. You know, really it's the most significant bit of evidence that we have for seeing who belonged to a family, who were the children of those parents. Because you see them there, the whole family in the census, and you can prove to yourself that they belong to each other. And that's what we're trying to do. That's the whole purpose, isn't it? So what we do use, instead of using the Scotland's People census, in most cases, sometimes you have to go there and get it, we would use the Ancestry census, which has been transcribed, and it has its problems. You know, they're not always good at I don't think they have people who know what they're talking about doing it, because they'll often do the name spellings in strange ways, but more significantly, the place names are often very weird. You know, they'll just do what they feel like. They have a go, but it's quite often wrong. And you need a translator. Fortunately, I've now built up an army of people who are prepared to properly transcribe the place names from what they see in Ancestry. There's a thing called FreeCell. I don't know if any of you have used FreeCell. Have you? You know that what I'm talking about? It's you just Google FreeCell, and all over Britain, volunteers were transcribing from the original censuses into a database. Personally, I don't find the search tool very good, but also because they were volunteers, they didn't ever really finish all of them. I don't know actually where they're up to today, but at one stage the Ross-shire censuses were only done in FreeCell up to 1880. The later ones were not yet done. They hadn't found a volunteer to do it, you know what I mean? Find My Past is probably the next port of call. Go to Ancestry first. If that you can't find it there, try Find My Past. That's a separate subscription service, you know. So you might not have that. The other thing I should say at this point is that the 1911 census is not available in Ancestry. It's available in Scotland's People, and that's because Scotland's People won't permit Ancestry to publish the transcription of the census itself. The Scotland's People one, you see the original document. The Ancestry one, you only see the transcription. This is an example of census in Strathconnell. You know where that is now? And in fact, you can see up there, it says in brackets, Strathconnell. You see that? And what I'm going to, this is 1841. Look at the spelling of the name here. Look at that. Tells you, even the Scotland's People, this is a Scotland's People document, right? So even Scotland's People doesn't always get it right. And, you know, you can see how that would come out of that if you didn't know what you were looking at. So this is the family we're talking about here. This fellow, he's called Alex R. And you know, he's transcribed as Alexander. MacLennan, 50, farmer, his wife, Christy, yeah, all makes sense now. We talked about these, that's the earlier, about the mid-1800s version of that name. And that says D.O., ditto. And she's only 35, so she's got, yeah, she's that. And these are their kids. These are their kids, but you can see here on this particular one, the 1841 census, it doesn't tell you that these are in fact their children. There's no comment about this is a son or a daughter or whatever, or a visitor. And these are the other people in the family here. And you can see whether they're male or female. That's the different columns. And out here, it's worth knowing for the 1841 census that this says where born, and it says in this county or not in this county. So it says yes or no there. It just means that they were born in Ross and Cromarty, not in this particular parish even. So you can't be sure really what you're getting. And this is a bit indecipherable, this place. Okay. Now, I happen to have the 1851 census for this same family. This is the one we just looked at. That's the indecipherable place name. This is the modern spelling of that place name. Similar, but not the same. This is the, when you look at the map, you see that this place is actually between a place called Balnaut or Balnaut, whatever it is, and West Balnaut. So it's really, you know, they probably haven't moved when they're in this other place. It's just that they're putting in that one, the more specific place, and here they're putting the slightly broader locality. Look at this guy. He only gets 4 years older in those 10 years between 1841 and 1851. You know, age is dodgy, right? She's only got 5 years older. Murdo is down, no, he's not there. Christy, the daughter, has got from being 11 to being 15. Yeah, and so on. Duncan, who was 1, is now, well, you know, he's this Duncan here, actually. He's 13, he's not 1. People will say to you that the 1841 census rounded ages to the nearest 5. That's true sometimes, but not always true, and it's certainly not true of children. So it's a bit unlikely that you would call that rounded to the nearest 5. They just didn't know what their age was, or they lied about it. They probably didn't know what their age was.
Now, Bruce, I have a question. We went to a Who Do You Think You Are seminar in Boston, and they were saying with the census here in the States, you didn't have to speak to somebody in the household. You could speak to somebody, a neighbor or someone who said they knew you and would give false information because they didn't know. They just assumed. I had a grandparent who was in several census listed as from Germany and others from Russia. And it was just because somebody assumed that's where they were from.
Made it up. Yeah, in Scotland, I think they were a bit better at it. And the enumerators were often the school teacher or someone like that, because there were very few people who could write, and even write, let alone anything else, in these parishes. You know, in this sort of time we're talking about here. I happened, you know, I didn't do it intentionally, but I later, after I'd written this slide even, I learnt that this family emigrated from Strathconnell to Victoria in Australia the next year after this 1851 census was taken. And you can see the family on the voyage with their ages given on the voyage as well. And of course, that's often wrong. But that's another way of, you know, we happen to have the voyage manifest for this family going to Australia only a year later.
So how would you know that these families are the same identical families?
Well, that's a good point, Star. In this case, you mean, or in the voyage? In this case. Well, you can only see it by and this is really important when we come to look next week. We write into the person's notes our version of the transcription of the census with this extra information out here about where they were born and so on. And as the years would have gone on, if they'd stayed there, you would have seen the same pattern there for the whole family, not individuals. I mean, that's a huge amount more work for us to put those into the notes for each person, but we find it the key to locking the family in. In the 1851 census, you've got more. You know, we talked over here about not having what relationship they were to the head of the household, but over here you've got wife, daughter, son, daughter, yeah. And you've also got, as well as having the village where the parish where they came from, usually parish, not always parish, but usually. And you can see that the wife was from Kintail, you see that? And over here it only told us she was from Ross-shire somewhere, but Kintail is in Ross-shire, as we know, so that's good. And these others are from Content, which we know that Strathconnell is part of. And he's from Fodderty, you see that? So in the subsequent, if they'd stayed there, you would have seen that same pattern of the places. That's as important as the ages, really. If you see the same pattern with different ages, but the same places, you know, Fodderty, Kintail, Content, I find that very helpful.
Okay, because I think I probably would have seen them and said, oh, it's just a family using similar names.
That's it. Well,
because they just don't match up, and a couple of the children are there or not there.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. It's a bit of an art, not exact science, but that we find that incredibly valuable. It's very time consuming to put all those in, but as we're doing it, we're always thinking, this is so good to have this.
Bruce?
Yep.
I have a question before you go to the next slide. Looking at Alexander's age and the differential with Christy, his wife,
Yeah.
is it possible to assume or to look for a first wife?
Yeah. I don't know.
And how would you do that?
How would you do it? In this particular time, you might find some kids or something.
Yeah, that's what I mean, the age difference is so large, and assuming they were all married very young.
A clue might be if they had children who, if you know their marriage and they have children who are older than their marriage, then that's the best clue about there being a first marriage. You've got a census, you know that they married in, let's say, 1870, and they've got a kid in the family who's called a son, who's born in, earlier, 1860, say, then you've got a clue that there's a first marriage there. They're not always. Sometimes they had kids before they married. Not often, but sometimes.
It's just, my thought would be that he had been married before, perhaps.
Yeah, it's worth keeping open to those possibilities.
Thank you.
No worries. Yeah, age troubles. So you're lucky if the ages are even close. So this is a quote from somebody else who, was reviewing these slides. They said, tell them that you're lucky if the ages are even close. Because we're so pedantic now about being, the exact age, aren't we? But they weren't that fussed. And the 1841 we've seen has limitations. You've seen how we deal with it in the clan records by putting the whole census in. That helps us with the age problem. And ages too can be quite different at marriage. Like what we saw there, where the husband is much older than the let's say, call it the groom, is much older than the bride. Often the husband will make himself a bit younger to make it look not so bad, if that's the way to put it. And often, girls will look a bit old, try to be older or younger, or, you can't even rely on them giving their own age correctly at a marriage. That's the point. Normally you can rely on a marriage record as being the most reliable, because it's the only time you get to give your own name, isn't it? Like you don't get to give your own name when you're born or when you die. So that I tend to think of, I think before I started this whole thing, I thought the name you were given on your birth record was your name. But I more think now that the name you gave at your marriage is the name you'd be expected to find yourself as when you looked at other records, because it's the only time you give your own name, really, of those three events. What you call yourself, in other words. And the death ages could be quite wrong. I don't know if anybody has any examples that they'd like to give us about how different the ages are. Catherine, do you have any examples of you've seen that, where the death age is so wrong?
Yes, in fact, one of the people I think you saw in Dernish, her father died, in one census he was 72 and he died at 63. So we're still trying to find out, or her grandfather.
Yeah, exactly.
There seems to be a lot of that, the ages and the birth and the death are confusing.
Dodgy. You know that word? It's a good word.
We do.
And of course, you'd be surprised how many people each census get younger, particularly women. About, 10 years goes by, they only age 8 years. Another good thing I can tell you in that regard is that I've seen quite a few MacLennan deaths where the person died of old age, and the period that they had the old age for was only 1 week.
Well, that's a good thing.
So, welcome to the clan. It's a good thing. That's it. Only had the old age for a week. But, often the age at death is given by someone who might be a neighbour, or might be a nephew, or somebody who doesn't really know the person very well. And how do they know, really? They don't know. They just, assume. And usually it'll be, well, I was going to say younger than they really are, but could be either way. Could be either way. Wrong. So this concludes our talking part, and that is now getting on in time. And these are other places you can go to find out more about Scotland's people and how to use it. Guidance, you see this is the help and guidance section, help and guidance. And then technical issues if you can't do things. They're quite helpful. Oh, I should say, a really good thing about Scotland's people I learned in 2014, I was talking to the fellow who runs Scotland's People, and he said to me, don't forget, you know, that you can get re-scans of these pages, of the documents, if you can't read them. Oh, that's interesting, I thought. And since then, I've done it a lot. I'm always writing into them saying, I don't abuse it, but just once, I think they said to me, look, you can read this really, you're just looking for a better version. But generally speaking, they're very willing to rescan the document in more legible form. Why are they doing that? Because the documents you get when you buy them online are made from the microfilm, not made from the original documents. And the microfilming was a bit fuzzy, you know, like it wasn't very high resolution microfilming. And then they converted the microfilm into these documents that we buy. And so when you ask for a rescan, they will go away and do a new one, and it's so much better, the ones that come back, and they've got the capacity to do it. And as long as you've got things that you think are illegible, you can sort of, you know, argue that it's worth them doing it, then you can just ask for it, and they don't charge, and they're very cheerful about it. They send it back to you in 2 or 3 days, email you a copy. Yeah. But that's the other thing I was going to say there is that I did that a week or so ago, and they came back to me saying, sorry, you can't read the document, but we don't have enough staff during the virus time to do this. We'll give you a credit for the payment you made for the document you can't read. So that's something for post-virus world to remember to ask for a rescan. You can do it any time. You don't have to do it, you know, immediately anyway. Just put it on hold till you get the thing. Yeah, so that's about the Scotland people.